He dreamed of a quiet life away from the city. He bought a house near the forest, thinking he had found paradise. But when he found a secret passageway under the trees, he realized he had made the worst mistake of his life. See what his curiosity led to. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. Aaron Miller had never thought he would leave the city. For years he had lived in a cycle that seemed unbreakable, working long hours in a crowded office filled with artificial light and stale air. Every day he fought through traffic, surrounded by thousands of others doing the same, all rushing and pushing, but never arriving anywhere meaningful. The sound of car horns, the flickering glow of neon signs, the endless murmur of people passing through narrow sidewalks. These things had woven themselves into the very fabric of his life until he no longer noticed them. And yet, in the quiet moments late at night, when he returned to his small rented apartment and sat alone staring at the gray walls, a question always pressed itself against him. Was this all there was? He had carried that question for years, bearing it under routine, until the day his mother died. Her passing struck him harder than he expected. She had been the last link to a sense of home, the only person who had cared to remind him that life was more than paychecks and deadlines. Her illness had taken her slowly, stealing her strength while she continued to encourage him with gentle words. In the end, she left behind little more than a few savings and a box of old belongings. Aaron had stood in her apartment after the funeral, looking at her clock ticking steadily on the mantel, and felt something inside him break. She had worked until her body gave out, never having the chance to escape the grind of survival. The thought haunted him, and in that moment he knew he could not follow the same path. It was grief that pushed him to sell everything and leave the city, but it was something deeper that guided him toward the wilderness. He searched for weeks until he found it, an old wooden house with a stone foundation, standing alone near the edge of a dense forest. The property was vast, stretching into meadows and tangled woods, the kind of land he had only ever seen in photographs. The house itself had stood for more than a century, its timbers weathered by countless storms, its windows staring blankly into the trees. The price was almost absurdly low, and while part of him wondered why, the larger part of him saw it as fate. Papers were signed, his belongings were packed, and within weeks he was standing before the porch of his new home, with the weight of the city finally behind him. From the very first breath, the air felt different. It was sharp and clean, filled with the scent of pine needles, damp earth, and leaves stirred by the wind. He drew it into his lungs as if it could wash away everything he had carried before. The silence, too, was something he had not known in years. It was not the hollow quiet of his apartment at night, filled with the muffled sounds of neighbors through thin walls. This was the silence of space and distance, of trees rising tall around him and swallowing every echo. The forest stretched in all directions, an endless maze of trunks and shadows, while the meadow shimmered with wildflowers bending under the morning light. At first, the house felt foreign to him. The floorboards groaned under his footsteps, the beams creaked in the wind, and the shutters rattled like whispers in the dark. But Aaron found charm in these imperfections. He placed his mother's clock on the mantel where it ticked faithfully, unpacked boxes of books to fill the shelves, and hung faded photographs of his parents on the walls. Slowly, he began to settle into the rhythm of a life he had never imagined he could have. He spent mornings walking barefoot through the grass, letting the earth press against his soles, and evenings sitting on the porch, watching as the light faded through the branches. The forest became a companion to him. It breathed around him, shifting with the weather and the seasons. In the mornings, mist drifted low across the meadow, curling around the trunks of trees before dissolving into the sky. Deer moved silently among the shadows, their delicate forms vanishing as quickly as they appeared. Birds darted between the branches, filling the air with sudden bursts of sound before falling quiet again. Each walk revealed something new, a cluster of mushrooms hidden under fallen leaves, the trail of a fox pressed into soft soil, the way sunlight filtered green through the canopy and dappled the ground. Yet the longer he lived there, the more Aaron sensed something else within the forest. It was subtle, a shadow that lingered at the edge of his awareness. Sometimes when he stopped to listen, he felt that the silence was not simply the absence of sound, but the presence of something watching, waiting. It unsettled him, though he told himself it was nothing more than imagination sharpened by isolation. After all, he had lived surrounded by noise his entire life. Perhaps true silence was too unfamiliar to feel natural. The villagers in the nearby town were polite enough when he introduced himself. They smiled, asked a few simple questions, and welcomed him in their own cautious way. But when he mentioned the forest, and particularly the area where it grew thickest near his land, their expressions shifted almost imperceptibly. A flicker of unease passed over their faces, quickly hidden behind neutral words. They told him the woods were old, that they carried stories, but offered nothing more. Aaron dismissed it at the time as superstition, the kind of folklore rural communities held on to as part of their identity. He laughed it off, even when an older man at the store muttered a quiet warning about places best left alone. Still, the forest seemed to grow heavier each time he stepped into it. The trees stood close together, their branches weaving into a canopy that blocked the light, and the ground beneath was uneven with roots and stones. One late afternoon, as the sun sank low and shadows stretched long, he wandered deeper than usual. The air was cool, the smell of moss thick around him. That was when he saw it, a patch of earth sunken at the base of a massive oak. Stones and tangled roots covered the depression, but what caught his attention was the faint current of air that rose from it, cold against his skin. He crouched to examine it more closely. The stones were arranged too neatly to be natural, their edges softened by age but their alignment deliberate. Moss grew thick over them, as if years of neglect had tried to bury the structure from sight. When Aaron brushed the surface with his hand, the air that slipped through the cracks was cooler still, carrying the damp smell of stone and earth. He frowned, the sensation prickling at the back of his neck. For a moment he imagined it was the breath of something alive beneath the soil. He told himself it was probably an old drainage system or the remnants of a collapsed well. Yet the thought would not leave him. The forest around the oak seemed darker, the silence pressing closer. When he finally rose to his feet and turned back toward the house, a strange unease followed him. He walked quickly through the trees, his steps louder than before, the rustle of leaves suddenly harsh against the quiet. By the time he reached the meadow, his chest felt tight and his hands were damp with sweat. That night he lay awake listening to the creaks of the house, the steady ticking of his mother's clock, and the whisper of wind outside the windows. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw the sunken stones, the hollow in the earth, and the faint cold breath that had touched his skin. It lingered in his mind long after he told himself it was nothing. Deep inside, he already knew that he would return to that place. Curiosity was a weight he could not set down, and the forest had given him a secret he could not ignore. Sleep offered Aaron no peace that night. Though he closed his eyes and turned from side to side in the creaking bed, his mind never released him from the image of that hollow in the earth. The stones pressed together in their unnatural arrangement returned to him again and again, and he could almost feel the cool air rising against his skin, even as the fire burned low in the hearth. He told himself it was foolishness, nothing more than the imagination of a man unaccustomed to the deep quiet of the countryside. But the thought would not leave him. By the time the first gray light of dawn filtered through the window, he knew he would not resist. He would have to return to that place beneath the oak, no matter what sense told him. The morning passed with restless preparation. He made coffee but barely drank it, distracted by the thought of the forest beyond the meadow. His hands shook as he tied a coil of rope and packed it alongside a flashlight and gloves. Each sound of the house, the ticking of the clock, the whisper of the wind through the shutters seemed to urge him forward. By midday, he could bear it no longer. He crossed the meadow quickly, the grass still wet with dew, and entered the shadowed embrace of the trees. The forest swallowed him more deeply that day. The branches knitted overhead, closing out much of the sky, and the air seemed colder, as though the sunlight could not quite pierce the canopy. Each step forward sent the smell of damp leaves rising around him, and with it came the sense that he was walking into a place not meant for him. The silence grew thicker with every yard until the sound of his own footsteps and the rhythm of his breath became too loud. When he reached the oak, the hollow waited, unchanged, as if it had been expecting his return. Aaron crouched and brushed aside the moss. The stones shifted under his hands, reluctant but yielding, as if they had not been touched for a century. The air that escaped was sharper now, the smell of old stone and decay clinging to it. He worked until the gap widened, revealing the top of a staircase cut directly into the earth. The sight stole his breath. These were not roots or random cracks in the soil. These were steps, ancient but unmistakably shaped by human hands. For a long moment he simply stared, unable to move. The forest around him held its breath, and he realized there was no turning back. He tied the rope to a root, tested its strength, and lowered himself into the opening. The first stone was slick with condensation, its surface cold beneath his boots. He steadied himself against the wall and switched on the flashlight. Its beam cut through the darkness, catching on damp surfaces that glistened faintly, and illuminated the beginning of the descent. He hesitated one final time, the rational part of his mind screaming at him to stop. Then he let go of the edge and committed himself to the darkness. The staircase descended steeply, the walls pressing close on either side. His breath echoed strangely, magnified by the narrow corridor, and the sound of dripping water struck the stone somewhere ahead, repeating steadily like the ticking of a hidden clock. Each step downward deepened the chill. The air grew heavy with moisture and minerals, carrying the metallic tang of rust and something more ancient, something that had been sealed away. Aaron's fingers brushed the walls as he descended, and he felt grooves in the stone, irregular marks, not quite natural, as though chisels had once bitten into the rock. Halfway down he paused and lifted the beam of light. The scratches became clearer, scattered across the surface in patterns too chaotic to be purposeful, yet too deliberate to dismiss. For a moment he imagined the ghostly forms of men working here, their tools ringing in the dark, their sweat dripping as they carved their way downward. The thought chilled him more than the air. He pressed on quickly, eager to reach the bottom before imagination could overwhelm him. At last the steps ended, and the passage leveled into a corridor that stretched ahead. The ceiling arched just above his head, forcing him to stoop as he moved forward. His boots squelched against damp stone, the sound echoing unnaturally far. He lifted the light and swept it along the walls where moss clung in stubborn patches and water ran in the thin trickles. The remnants of human presence were scattered here too, a bent nail half embedded in the stone, a splintered piece of wood, and something that looked like the length of a corroded chain, coiled like a snake abandoned to the dark. His chest tightened with unease, but curiosity pushed him forward. The corridor seemed endless, each step carrying him deeper into silence, until he felt sure that the world above had vanished entirely. Then at last the space widened. His flashlight beam reached out into a cavern that swallowed the light before revealing its edges. The sound of dripping water grew louder, magnified by the stone walls until it filled the chamber with a steady rhythm. He took a careful step forward, and then another, until the floor sloped downward and met the still surface of a vast underground lake. The sight stopped him where he stood. The water was black, reflecting the light in broken ripples each time a drop fell from the ceiling. The chamber stretched into shadow, its far walls hidden, its depth unknowable. The air was bitterly cold, pressing against his skin like ice. He moved closer, his boots slipping on stone slick with algae, and steadied himself with one hand against the wall. When the flashlight beam skimmed across the edge of the water, it caught on debris scattered along the shore. Splintered planks, rusted tools, twisted fragments of metal half buried in mud. Aaron crouched, heart hammering, and reached out to touch a fragment of chain. It disintegrated at his fingertips, crumbling into rust that clung to his skin. He wiped his hand against his jeans and lifted the light again. The water's surface shimmered faintly, and beneath it something caught his eye. Shapes angular, unnatural, lurking below the film of algae. For a moment he thought they might be illusions, distortions of the beam, but the longer he looked, the clearer they became. The corner of a crate, warped but intact, and within it the faint glimmer of metal. The sight sent a shiver racing through him. He leaned forward, almost compelled to reach into the water, but instinct pulled him back. The lake looked shallow, yet its surface gave no promise of safety. One wrong step could pull him under, and the thought of drowning in that black silence filled him with dread. He sat back on his heels, breath quick and shallow. It was enough for now to know what lay beneath. The mystery was no longer imagination, it was real, and it pressed against him, with a weight that felt unbearable. He swept the beam once more around the chamber. On the far side, partially collapsed, stood the remnants of a wooden structure that jutted into the water. It might once have been a platform or dock, now little more than skeletal beams clinging to the wall. Their presence confirmed what he had already begun to fear. This place had not been a natural cavern. It had been built, worked, and used. Men had come here with tools and wood and purpose, and then they had left, abandoning everything. The silence closed in around him. It was not the silence of peace, but of waiting, of something held too long beneath the earth. Aaron felt it pressing against his chest, urging him back, warning him that he had crossed a line. He rose slowly, the beam trembling in his hands, and turned toward the corridor. His footsteps echoed as he walked back to the staircase, and each step upward seemed heavier than the last. By the time he reached the circle of daylight above, his legs were trembling. He pulled himself onto the forest floor and gasped for air. The scent of pine and open sky rushed into his lungs, dizzying in its contrast. He stood for a long moment staring at the stones he had displaced, their mossy surfaces suddenly darker, heavier, more sinister. They no longer looked like remnants of the past. They looked like guardians. He had broken their seal, and whatever had been meant to stay hidden was no longer silent. When he returned to the house, the forest behind him seemed different. Its shadows stretched farther, its silence weighed more heavily. That night he lay awake, the sound of water dripping echoing in his ears, no matter how tightly he closed them. He dreamed of the lake rising, of beams collapsing, of crates splitting open to reveal their contents. And when the clock struck midnight, its ticking was indistinguishable from the rhythm of those drops falling in the dark. Aaron knew then that his descent was only the beginning. The forest had revealed its secret, and the underground lake had claimed him. He could not turn away, not now. Whatever truth lay beneath the trees, it had already taken root in him, and he was powerless to resist the pull. The night after Aaron's first descent into the earth was restless and oppressive. He had returned to the surface, gasping for air, grateful for the sharp scent of pine and the cool breath of the forest. But the relief was temporary. As soon as he closed the door of his house behind him, the silence of the underground chamber seemed to follow him, filling every corner of the rooms. He sat by the fire and tried to read, yet the words blurred before his eyes, replaced by the image of the black water glimmering faintly beneath the beam of his flashlight. Even the steady ticking of his mother's clock no longer brought comfort. It had taken on the cadence of the drops echoing in the cavern. When he finally lay down, exhaustion claimed his body but not his mind. He dreamed of the lake, of shapes beneath its surface, of beams collapsing into the depths. He woke more than once with a start, sweat dampening his brow, certain he could hear the water dripping within the very walls of the house. By morning his decision was made. Fear had whispered to him during the night, urging him to cover the stones, to abandon curiosity, to forget what he had seen. But a stronger voice, one that burned hotter and louder, told him he could not. The lake had taken hold of him. He could not let the vision of the crate, the glint of metal, the remnants of the dock fade away unanswered. He would go back, better prepared this time. He gathered gloves, a length of rope, and a crowbar. He packed extra batteries for the flashlight and slipped a notebook into his pocket. He told himself it was for recording observations, though in truth he only wanted proof that what he had seen was real. The path through the forest felt narrower than before, the trees leaning in close as if conspiring to block his way. The air was cool, but sweat gathered at the base of his neck. Birds were absent from the branches, their songs silenced as though the entire woodland knew where he was going. When he reached the oak, the hollow yawned at him, dark and patient. The circle of stones seemed heavier, more severe in their arrangement, as though they disapproved of his return. He ignored the thought and widened the opening he had created the day before, shoving aside damp soil and moss until the gap was large enough for him to descend again. The breath of the underground greeted him once more, sharp and metallic, carrying the taste of age. The descent was no easier than the first time. The stone steps groaned beneath his weight, slick with condensation, forcing him to move slowly. Each footfall echoed like an intrusion, reverberating through walls that seemed reluctant to welcome him. His flashlight beam cut through the dark, catching on patches of moss, on water trickling down, on scratches carved into the rock. He paused once to trace those marks with his fingers, wondering whether they had been made in construction or in desperation. The thought unsettled him, and he pressed forward quickly. When he reached the underground hall, the sight of the lake struck him with the same force as before. Its surface stretched into the darkness, silent and still, yet filled with menace. The broken beams clinging to the far wall jutted out like skeletal fingers, and the crates scattered at the edges remained stubborn in their decay. He moved to the spot where he had first found the rusted chain and crouched, digging into the mud with gloved hands. The muck sucked at his fingers, but soon he pulled free a fragment of wood, then another, until something solid resisted. With effort, he unearthed a rusted iron tool, its shape barely discernible, but heavy in his palm. Perhaps it had once been a hammer, perhaps a pickaxe. Either way, it confirmed what he already knew. Men had worked here. Men had left their tools and never returned. He set the fragment aside and dug further. More remnants appeared, a splinter of wood that might have belonged to a barrel, a shard of glass dulled by time, fragments of fabric so rotten they fell apart at his touch. Each piece was a whisper from the past, an echo of lives once lived in this chamber. Then, pressed between two planks of wood, he found something that stilled his breath. It was a scrap of paper, fragile and stained, but still holding traces of ink. He lifted it carefully, half expecting it to crumble. The writing was faint, blurred by water and time, yet one thing remained visible: a date, 1894. The number struck him with a peculiar force. This was not some nameless ruin of an ancient era. Barely more than a century ago, people had stood here, carved their way into this stone, worked and written and recorded their presence. The thought filled him with awe and dread. He slipped the scrap into his notebook and sat back on his heels, his breath quickening. If this place had been alive with human labor in 1894, then why had it been abandoned so completely, sealed beneath moss and soil? The question gnawed at him even as he continued to explore. At the far side of the chamber, where the water lapped silently at the stone, he found another crate, its form warped but intact enough to hold together. With effort, he looped the rope around it and pulled, straining until it shifted with a sickening squelch of mud and water. He dragged it onto the shore, its wood groaning, its seams leaking foul-smelling water. He pried at the lid with the crowbar until the wood splintered. Inside lay a tangle of rusted tools, scraps of fabric, and beneath them, another piece of paper, soaked but legible enough to reveal a fragment of words. Leave before. The rest was lost to decay, but the meaning was clear. It was a warning. Aaron froze, the paper limp in his hand. Leave before what? Before the water rose? Before the walls collapsed? Before something else? Something unnamed and worse? The words echoed in his head as he stared into the black lake. The silence seemed to throb with them, pressing against his chest. He remembered the old man in the village store, the way his eyes had darkened at the mention of the lake, and realized that silence might have been a shield. Perhaps they knew more than they would say. Perhaps they carried fragments of the same warning in their own memory. His curiosity pushed him deeper. At the far end of the chamber, where the walls seemed less solid, he noticed a narrow passage leading away. He approached cautiously, the beam of his flashlight trembling in his hand. The tunnel was low and partially collapsed, forcing him to duck beneath sagging supports. The smell of damp wood and rust grew stronger as he advanced. His boots slipped in the mud, sending echoes ahead of him, and then the corridor opened into a smaller chamber. Here the air was thicker, heavier, as though the place had been sealed too long. Piles of debris filled the corners. Broken planks, rusted rods, shattered remains of barrels. The barrels had split open, their contents long since drained into the soil, but a faint chemical odor lingered, sharp and unsettling. He crouched, imagining what might have been stored here. Powder, perhaps explosives. His mind conjured images of men hurriedly stacking barrels, of lanterns swaying, of work done in secrecy. If this place had been more than a mine, if it had been something illicit, then its abandonment had not been an accident. It had been deliberate. He lifted the light to the walls and froze. Scratches covered the stone, not the scattered grooves of chisels, but marks carved with desperate force. Vertical lines, uneven, grouped in fours with a fifth crossing through. Tally marks, dozens running in irregular rows. His throat tightened as he traced them with his gloved hand. These were not the marks of builders. These were the days of someone who had been trapped here, counting time in the dark. Beneath them, deeper and jagged, another message had been carved. We cannot leave. The words struck him harder than the warning on the paper. They were not vague, not incomplete. They were final, absolute. Whoever had carved them had done so in despair, scratching letters into stone because no one else would ever hear them. Aaron staggered back, the flashlight beam shaking wildly across the chamber. His breath came ragged, his chest constricted. The tally marks and the message burned into his vision. For the first time, he wished he had never touched the stones, never pried into the earth, never followed curiosity into darkness. But it was too late. He could not unsee the marks. He could not erase the words from his mind. As he stumbled back through the tunnel into the main hall, the sound of water dripping seemed louder than before, deliberate, like footsteps pacing in shallow pools. Panic surged through him, urging him upward. He reached the steps and climbed quickly, his boots slipping, his hands trembling as he grasped the rope. When he emerged into daylight, he collapsed on the grass, his breath tearing in and out of his chest. The forest stood around him, silent and still, yet it no longer brought comfort. The trees seemed taller, darker, closing in around the clearing, as though to keep the secret hidden. He pressed his face into his hands, the words carved into stone echoing in his mind. We cannot leave. That night he sat at his kitchen table with the scraps of paper spread before him. The date, the unfinished warning, the names scrawled in faded ink. He whispered them to himself, as though speaking could summon meaning from the fragments. But only the silence answered, the silence of a forest that had watched generations come and go, and the silence of a chamber beneath the earth that refused to be forgotten. He could not stop now. He had uncovered too much. The truth was buried, but he was bound to it, and the deeper he went, the more he feared that the words on the wall might one day be his own. The words carved into the wall haunted Aaron through the night. He had whispered them at his kitchen table until the fire burned low, until the clock on the mantel ticked into the small hours, and even then they would not leave him. We cannot leave. He had seen them in his dreams, etched in fire against stone, written in shadows across the trees outside his window. He woke more than once to the sound of dripping water, but this time it was not the echo of memory. It was in the very walls of the house, seeping from corners where no water could be. He pressed his pillow over his ears, yet the sound remained, steady and patient, like a clock counting down. By the time dawn crept across the meadow, Aaron knew with painful clarity that there was no escape. He told himself he would not go back. He told himself he would patch the opening with soil and stone, seal it so tightly that no breath of air could ever rise from the earth again. He wandered through the rooms of the house that morning, touching each wall as though saying goodbye. He stopped at his mother's clock and watched the pendulum swing, wishing its rhythm could erase the memory of water falling into darkness. Yet even as he repeated the vow to stay away, his hands betrayed him. They packed gloves, rope, batteries, and the crowbar into his bag. They slipped the scraps of paper into his notebook. They prepared him as though they already knew the truth. He was going back. The forest seemed changed when he entered it again. Though the sun was high, its light was dim beneath the branches. The trees leaned close above him, their trunks crowding together, and the air pressed damp against his skin. His steps were muffled, swallowed by moss and roots, and he felt the weight of eyes upon him, though he was alone. When he reached the oak, the circle of stones waited as before, but they seemed darker now, their surfaces slick with dew, their arrangement stern and unyielding. They were not remnants of the past. They were a seal, a warning, and he had already broken it. The breath of the underground rose to meet him as he slipped through the opening, cool and metallic, carrying the taste of stone and age. He descended quickly this time, the stone steps no longer strangers, but familiar under his boots. Yet familiarity brought no comfort. The walls pressed close, wet with condensation, and each drop of water that fell into the depths below echoed like a whisper of his name. He told himself to breathe, to move slowly, but his pulse beat too hard, and his breath came ragged as he pushed into the hall. The lake stretched before him, unchanged in its silence. Its surface lay dark and still, punctuated only by the plop of droplets striking from the ceiling. The broken beams jutted like bones from the far wall, their skeletal forms half submerged. The crates remained where he had left them, warped and silent in their slow decay. Yet something felt different. The air was heavier, the silence sharper. It pressed against him with the weight of a presence that had been stirred from slumber. He moved with methodical determination, sweeping the light across the chamber, crouching to study the remnants of beams, the rotted wood, the collapsed platform that had once extended into the water. Each detail whispered of labor and abandonment. He imagined men walking across those planks, carrying crates heavy with tools or supplies, their lanterns swaying, their voices echoing against the stone. He imagined the moment when all those sounds ceased, when silence fell so absolute that even the walls seemed to hold their breath. The thought sent a shiver crawling down his spine. At the far end of the hall, he turned toward the narrower passage he had discovered before, the one with the collapsed barrels and the desperate tally marks on the wall. The memory of those scratches still chilled him, yet he could not resist. He ducked beneath sagging beams and entered the tunnel again. The smell of rust and rot was stronger now, filling his lungs with each breath. His flashlight caught on broken planks and shattered barrels, their contents long since drained away. The air grew thicker with each step, as though the chamber resented his intrusion. When he reached the smaller chamber, his light revealed the same mound of debris piled high against the wall. He pulled at the planks with trembling hands, shifting wood that groaned as it moved, until the shape beneath was revealed again, a bed frame twisted with rust, its springs coiled like broken wire. Around it lay scraps of fabric, fragments of personal belongings, a boot without its sole, a shattered lantern. These were not the remnants of labor. They were the remnants of life, of someone who had lived here, slept here, died here. He staggered back, nausea rising, his light trembling across the scarred walls. The tally marks multiplied before his eyes, dozens of them, carved in uneven rows, days or weeks of someone's captivity, and beneath them, carved deeper than the rest, the words that had seared themselves into his memory. "We cannot leave." The letters were jagged, cut with desperation, each stroke a cry for freedom that never came. Aaron pressed his hand against the stone, feeling the grooves beneath his fingertips, and the despair of that unknown prisoner settled into his bones. He imagined the final moments, the hopeless scratching of words in the dark, the silence that followed. Panic surged through him, but so too did a strange compulsion. He lifted the light higher, scanning the wall, and saw what he had missed before. A section of stone looked different from the rest, uneven as though bricks had been fitted together to conceal something. He pried at them with the crowbar, his breath ragged, until one by one the bricks gave way and fell with dull thuds onto the floor. Behind them was a cavity just large enough for a man to crouch. He shone the light inside and froze. The walls of the cavity were scarred with scratches. Not words this time, but vertical lines etched in uneven rows, tally after tally after tally, stretching across every surface. The air inside was stale, unmoving, heavy with the scent of time. His throat tightened as realization struck. This had not been a storage space. It had been a prison. Someone had been sealed inside, counting days in the dark until time itself lost meaning. At the bottom of one wall, carved with furious force, were the words, "We cannot leave." The chamber closed in around him. The walls seemed to press tighter, the air to thicken until every breath was a struggle. The dripping of water grew louder, no longer a distant plop but a steady rhythm, like footsteps approaching from the hall. He swung the light back toward the tunnel, his panic mounting, and stumbled over the twisted bed frame as he rushed to escape. The shadows danced wildly across the stone, twisting into shapes that seemed to move just out of sight. His chest burned, his breath tearing at his lungs, but he forced himself onward until he burst back into the main hall. The lake waited in silence. Its surface was unbroken, its edges still lined with debris. Yet Aaron could not shake the feeling that something had shifted, that the chamber itself was watching him. He backed slowly toward the corridor, his legs trembling, the beam of light trembling with them. When he reached the steps, his body sagged with relief, and he climbed quickly, gripping the rope with shaking hands until the circle of daylight appeared above. He pulled himself into the clearing and collapsed onto the grass, gasping for air. The forest stood silent around him, but it no longer brought peace. The trees rose high, their branches knitting together to block the sky, their shadows deep and watchful. The meadow behind him felt smaller, the air colder, as though the forest itself had drawn closer while he was beneath it. He pressed his hands to his face, but the images would not fade. The tally marks, the rusted bed, the scratches, the words carved into stone. "We cannot leave." He returned to the house in a daze, his footsteps heavy, his chest still tight with dread. On the kitchen table he laid out the scraps of paper once more, smoothing them flat with trembling hands. The date, the unfinished warning, the names, and now the carved message. They stared back at him with the weight of truth, undeniable and suffocating. He whispered them again, as if repeating them could grant him control, but each word only deepened his despair. He had wanted peace, solitude, a new life in the quiet of the countryside. Instead, he had unearthed a nightmare buried beneath the earth, and in doing so, he had bound himself to it. That night he did not sleep. He lay in bed with the blanket drawn high, listening to the steady drip of water that echoed within the walls. It was no longer memory or dream. It was here, inside the house, following him like a shadow. Every drop fell in rhythm with his heartbeat, a reminder that he had become part of the silence beneath the earth. By dawn he knew he could not remain. The weight of it was too much, the silence too heavy, the knowledge too terrible. He would have to leave. He packed a suitcase with trembling hands, clothes, a few books, his mother's clock. He stared at the papers on the table for a long while, debating whether to abandon them. But in the end, he slipped them into the suitcase as well. They belonged to him now. The story was his, no matter how much he wished to forget. When morning came, he carried the suitcase to the car. The meadow was damp with dew, the air sharp with the promise of another cold day. He paused at the edge of the clearing, staring back at the house, and for a moment he considered abandoning everything, locking the door and pretending none of it had ever happened. But the thought dissolved quickly. The lake lay just beyond the trees and denial would never erase it. He started the engine and drove down the narrow road, the forest rising close on either side. In the mirror, he caught sight of the lake one last time. Its surface lay calm and still, reflecting the pale morning sky. For an instant, it looked beautiful, the kind of scene he had once dreamed of when imagining peace in the countryside. But he knew better now. The stillness was not peace. It was silence, deliberate and heavy. The silence of secrets that should never have been uncovered. He drove on, but the knowledge remained. He had wanted freedom, but he had traded one prison for another. The tally marks, the desperate carvings, the words etched into stone. They were etched into him now as well. He had left the house, left the forest, left the circle of stones and the underground lake, but he would never truly leave. He was bound to the silence beneath the trees, another name among the list, another mark on the wall. And though the road stretched empty before him, Aaron knew with painful certainty that the forest would never let him go. If this story kept you on the edge, make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next one. Take a moment to check out our other videos for more unbelievable stories still to come. And don't forget to share this video with your friends and family. Some mysteries are too powerful to keep to yourself.